I never thought the man who let his family crush my heart would be the first to hold my baby. Trapped by a historic blizzard in a rundown mountain clinic 7 months after our divorce, he thought he was just saving a critical patient. He had no idea that when his blood-stained hands delivered the child, he would face the brutal proof of his father's lies and the ultimate price for abandoning the wife he once swore to protect. Hello, dear listeners of Zoe Revenge Stories, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here with us today. Unfortunately, YouTube recently disabled our monetization, leaving us with no budget to keep this channel running. If you find today's story captivating, please consider supporting us with just $1 by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description or comments. Your generosity pays our hardworking staff so they can afford their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. My name is Autumn Weaver. I am 32 years old, and for the better part of a decade, my life was built on steel, concrete, and the precise calculation of load-bearing structures as a structural engineer at Vanguard Pinnacle Dynamics here in Denver, Colorado. I spent my days in a male-dominated industry, fighting for every ounce of respect I earned. I knew how to reinforce foundations so they would not crack under immense pressure. I only wish I had applied that same rigorous mathematics to my own marriage. I was married to Dr. Julian Vance, to the outside world. Julian was a savior in scrubs. He was a brilliant obstetrician and trauma surgeon who spent his days bringing life into the world and pulling people back from the brink of death. But behind the closed doors of Denver's elite circles, he was something else entirely. He was the golden boy, the prized possession of his father, Arthur Vance. Arthur was a real estate mogul whose arrogance was only eclipsed by his immense wealth. To Arthur, people were not human beings. They were assets to be acquired, managed, or discarded when their depreciation value dropped too low. For 5 years, our marriage looked like a perfectly curated magazine spread. We attended the right charity galas, smiled for the cameras, and played our parts in the suffocating theater of high society. But beneath the velvet and champagne, a quiet rot was taking hold. I spent my days calculating stress loads for massive commercial buildings, yet I could not calculate the emotional toll of living with a family that viewed me as nothing more than a defective incubator. We wanted a child, or rather, the Vance dynasty demanded an heir. Month after month, year after year, every attempt to conceive ended in the agonizing sight of a single line on a pregnancy test. The failure was a silent ghost haunting our expansive, immaculate home, and in the Vance family, failure was never a shared burden, it was always assigned. In Arthur's eyes, the flaw was entirely mine. The breaking point did not come in a private, tearful argument. It happened exactly where Arthur wanted it to happen. Under the dazzling chandeliers of an exclusive private country club, surrounded by Denver's wealthiest power players. It was a Saturday evening. The clinking of crystal glasses and the hum of pretentious networking filled the dining hall. I was wearing a silk dress that felt more like a straitjacket. The conversation around our table shifted to legacy, and Arthur, swirling his bourbon, locked his cold, calculating eyes on me. The room grew quiet as his voice carried over the long mahogany table. "You see, gentlemen," Arthur began, his tone dripping with a mockingly polite venom. "The problem with modern women is they try to conquer men's worlds and forget their biological duties. Look at my daughter-in-law. All that masculine, stressful construction work out in the dirt and the dust. It is no wonder she cannot give me a grandson. The stress has completely withered her body. She is nothing but a broken mold." The silence that followed was deafening. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others stared down into their porcelain plates, unwilling to cross a man of Arthur's terrifying influence. But my eyes were not on the crowd. They were locked entirely on my husband, the man who had vowed to protect me, the man who held my hand in the cold, sterile fertility clinics, and whispered that we would get through this together. I waited for Julian to stand up. I waited for him to slam his glass down, to defend my honor, to tell his father that he had crossed an unforgivable line. But Julian did nothing. He stared down at his untouched steak, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He completely avoided my gaze. He did not say a single word in my defense. In that suffocating silence, his inaction spoke far louder than Arthur's cruelty. Julian's silence was an absolute surrender. It was an implicit agreement with his father's public humiliation of me. He chose the inheritance, the status, and the comfort of his father's empire over the woman he called his wife. I did not cry. Crying would have given Arthur the twisted satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I stood up, calmly placed my linen napkin on the table, and walked out of the club, leaving the toxic, fake world of the Vances behind me in the freezing Colorado air. I packed my bags that very night. When a foundation is irreparably cracked, you do not stay inside the building and wait for the roof to collapse. You evacuate. I moved out of our sterile mansion and rented a small apartment. I thought Julian might come after me, might finally find his spine and beg for forgiveness. I was completely wrong. Just 3 weeks later, I was served with divorce papers. He did not even have the courage to deliver them himself. The stated reason was not infertility, of course, because that would be too ugly for the public record. The legal document neatly cited misaligned visions for the future. Just like that, 5 years of my life were wiped away by the stroke of a pen, orchestrated by a tyrannical father and executed by a spineless son. Exactly 8 weeks after the judge slammed the heavy wooden gavel and finalized my divorce, the solid ground literally dropped out from under me. I was standing on the 4th level of a new commercial high-rise project for Vanguard Pinnacle Dynamics, reviewing complex steel reinforcement plans. The deafening roar of heavy cranes and the relentless grinding of concrete drillers provided my daily soundtrack. Suddenly, the bright midday sun seemed to dim. My vision blurred into a dizzying smear of yellow hard hats and gray concrete pillars. A loud, high-pitched buzzing in my ears completely drowned out the heavy machinery. The very next thing I knew, I was staring up at the harsh fluorescent lights of a nearby urgent care clinic, tasting a mixture of drywall dust and copper in my dry mouth. A young emergency room physician walked in, holding a digital medical tablet. He gave me a polite, reassuring smile and said, "Miss Weaver, your blood pressure dropped significantly due to dehydration and sheer physical exhaustion, which is quite common in your condition." I blinked, my head pounding with a vicious ache. "What condition?" I asked, my voice raspy and weak. He looked at me, his smile faltering into slight confusion. "You are pregnant. You are about 9 weeks along, judging by your hormone levels and the ultrasound we just performed." The small, sterile room started spinning all over again. 9 weeks. My engineering brain instantly calculated the timeline. That meant conception happened right before that disastrous night at the country club, right before my entire world exploded into pieces. For 5 grueling, tear-filled years, I had subjected my body to countless invasive fertility treatments, desperately chasing a positive result to satisfy my former father-in-law's tyrannical demands. And now, precisely when the marriage was dead, buried, and legally severed, a stubborn spark of life decided to take hold. A massive wave of cosmic irony washed over me, immediately followed by a fierce, blinding panic. If Julian or Arthur ever found out about this child, they would undoubtedly unleash their army of high-priced lawyers. They would try to rip my baby away, strip me of my rights, and mold this innocent child into the next obedient heir of the Vance real estate empire. I placed a trembling hand flat against my stomach and made a silent, unbreakable vow. They would never, ever know. This child was 100% mine. I needed physical distance to breathe and build a safe fortress for the two of us. I paid the financial penalty to break my city lease and moved into a compact, tidy apartment on the quiet suburban outskirts, right in the shadow of the imposing Rocky Mountains. The crisp, pine-scented mountain air became my sanctuary. I threw myself relentlessly into my architectural blueprints, taking on extra design work to secure a bulletproof financial future before the baby arrived. But my body had other plans. The morning sickness was absolutely brutal and completely unforgiving. There were days when I could barely keep down a single slice of dry toast, let alone climb steel scaffolding in the freezing wind. That was when Sarah stepped in. Sarah was a senior project manager at the firm, a tough, no-nonsense woman who wore scuffed steel-toed boots and routinely chewed out lazy contractors for breakfast. When she caught me throwing up behind a massive stack of drywall on a Tuesday morning, she did not offer me useless pity. She just handed me a cold bottle of water, locked her jaw, and became my ultimate shield on the site. "If anyone asks," Sarah told me, her arms crossed defensively over her high-visibility jacket, "you are dealing with a severe bleeding stomach ulcer. You do the complex math at your desk, and I will handle all the yelling on the site." She kept the nosy corporate executives far away and made sure I never lifted anything heavier than a digital stylus. Thanks to the relentless gossip mill of our mutual acquaintances, I soon learned exactly why Julian had moved on so effortlessly. Barely 3 months after our divorce papers were signed, news broke that my ex-husband was officially engaged to the youngest daughter of a prominent state senator. It was a highly publicized, politically motivated match, perfectly orchestrated by Arthur to expand his commercial zoning influence. Hearing that news did not break my heart. It cured it. It completely validated my decision to disappear into the mountains. Julian was exactly where he belonged, acting as a shiny, well-behaved pawn on his father's glittering chessboard. As my waistline expanded, so did my fierce, unyielding independence. During the quiet, freezing nights when the mountain winds howled against my apartment windows, I would sit at my drafting table under a warm yellow desk lamp. The very first time I felt a tiny, definitive kick against my ribs, I gasped aloud, dropping my drafting pencil onto the wooden floor. Hot tears pricked my eyes, not from sorrow or loneliness, but from an overwhelming sense of raw power. That tiny flutter was a drumbeat of war. Every subsequent movement inside me fueled my intense drive to work harder, to draft better designs, and to negotiate larger construction contracts. I was no longer a broken mold trying to fit into a toxic family. I was the master architect of my own life, meticulously constructing a small, unshakable empire from the ground up, and I was going to do it without relying on any man. The encrypted notification arrived on a bleak Thursday evening. I was reviewing structural loads on my laptop when my phone buzzed. It was an email from a secure, untraceable server. The subject line contained only my patient identification number from the elite private fertility clinic Julian and I had frequented. The message inside was brief. It demanded an in-person meeting at a rundown diner off the interstate, promising information that would rewrite my entire past. My engineering instincts screamed at me to ignore it, but the ghost of my trauma demanded answers. I walked into the dimly lit diner at 9 o'clock the following night. The air smelled of stale coffee and burnt grease. Sitting in the furthest corner booth was a nervous, trembling man wearing a faded gray coat. I recognized him instantly. He was a senior laboratory technician from the clinic. He constantly checked over his shoulder as I slid into the cracked vinyl seat opposite him. "I was terminated last month," he whispered, his hands shaking as he gripped a ceramic coffee mug. "They fired me to tie up loose ends, but my conscience has been bleeding out ever since I processed your files. I cannot carry this weight anymore." He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, unmarked brown envelope. He slid it across the sticky table. I did not touch it immediately. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Open it," he urged, his voice cracking. I broke the seal. Inside were copies of laboratory results, internal clinic emails, and offshore bank transfer receipts. The top document was a raw, unaltered fertility analysis with my name on it. I scanned the biological markers and the hormonal panels. My breath hitched. Everything was flawless. My reproductive health was absolutely optimal. I was never a broken mold. "It was never you," the technician said, his eyes filled with a desperate apology. "It was him, Dr. Vance." I flipped to the next page. It was Julian's authentic medical file. The numbers were disastrous. His sperm count and motility were practically non-existent. The crushing psychological pressure of pleasing his father, combined with the brutal 80-hour work weeks of a trauma surgeon, had completely decimated his biological ability to reproduce. He was the one incapable of passing on the precious Vance legacy. A cold, sharp realization began to slice through my confusion. If Julian was the problem, I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low, then why did every doctor in that building tell me I was the failure? The technician pointed a trembling finger at the banking receipts stapled to the back of the packet. Because your father-in-law bought their silence. I stared at the financial records. There were wire transfers totaling $75,000, routed from a shell corporation owned by Arthur Vance directly into the personal account of the clinic's medical director. Next to the receipts were printed copies of encrypted emails between Arthur and the director. The instructions were clinically cruel and undeniably clear. Arthur ordered the laboratory to completely falsify our medical profiles. He paid them to doctor the lab results, projecting Julian's biological failure onto me. Arthur Vance knew, the technician explained. He knew his golden boy was flawed, but Arthur could never allow the Vance name to carry the stigma of inadequacy. So, he bought a lie. He made sure you took the blame so Julian would eventually leave you, freeing him up to marry a woman from a more politically advantageous family. Arthur engineered your divorce from the very beginning. The diner around me faded into a white, buzzing noise. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal threatened to crack my mind in two. For 5 years, I had injected my stomach with painful hormones. I had cried myself to sleep on the bathroom floor. I had endured the public humiliation and the private agony of feeling like less than a woman, and it was all a masterfully crafted illusion, paid for by a tyrannical billionaire. But as I stared at the irrefutable evidence of Arthur's crime, the burning rage inside me slowly crystallized into something entirely different. It turned into a glacial, terrifying calm. Suddenly, I saw Julian not just as a coward who had abandoned me, but as a profoundly pathetic victim of his own life. Julian did not know he was sterile. Arthur had kept him entirely in the dark, feeding him the same forged documents they fed me. Julian had blindly trusted his father, sacrificing the woman he claimed to love simply because he lacked the backbone to question the narrative handed to him. He was a puppet, emotionally and biologically hollowed out, dancing on strings pulled by a monster. The technician watched me, expecting me to scream, to cry, or to immediately call the police. I did none of those things. I neatly placed the documents back into the brown envelope and tucked it securely into my coat. "Thank you," I said softly. I walked out into the freezing night air. I held the power to destroy the Vance empire right there in my hands. I could go to the press. I could file a massive medical malpractice lawsuit tomorrow morning, but doing so would only create a chaotic media circus. It would give Arthur the opportunity to hire expensive spin doctors and drag my name through the mud all over again. My structural engineering background taught me one fundamental rule about demolitions. If you want to bring down a massive, corrupt structure, you do not throw rocks at the windows. You quietly locate the main load-bearing pillar. You plant your explosives precisely at the base, and you wait. You wait for the absolute perfect moment to trigger the blast. I patted the envelope through my coat. My vengeance was not going to be a loud, messy tantrum. It was going to be an exact, calculated implosion, and I had all the time in the world to wait. Exactly 7 months had passed since the judge legally dissolved my marriage. I was 34 weeks pregnant, carrying the secret of my survival directly beneath my heart. I had meticulously planned every detail of my impending motherhood, calculating risks and reinforcing my financial foundation. But human engineering is entirely useless against the raw, unbridled fury of nature. Without any warning, a historic blizzard violently slammed into the state of Colorado. It was not merely a winter storm. It was a catastrophic atmospheric event that paralyzed every major highway, burying the entire landscape under an impenetrable sheet of white ice. On that morning, I was miles away from the safety of Denver. Sarah and I were conducting a preliminary terrain survey for a remote mountain lodge project. We were sitting inside our heavy-duty work truck, reviewing topological maps while the wind howled like a wounded animal against the reinforced glass. I reached for my thermos, intending to pour a cup of hot tea. I never made it. A sudden, agonizing cramp seized my lower back, sharp and terrifying. I dropped the thermos, letting it clatter onto the floorboards. Before I could even process the sensation, a warm rush of fluid soaked through my thick winter trousers. My water had broken. I was only at 34 weeks. It was far too early. "Sarah!" I gasped, clutching my swollen belly as a second, far more violent contraction ripped through my uterus. "The baby is coming, right now." Sarah did not ask useless questions. She took one look at my pale face, threw the topographic maps into the back seat, and slammed the heavy truck into drive. What followed was a desperate, death-defying descent down a treacherous mountain pass. The visibility was absolutely zero. The roads were entirely obliterated by the blinding snow. Sarah gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, fighting the fishtailing tires as we skidded violently close to the edge of sheer cliffs. Every single time the truck jolted over a hidden ice rut. Another contraction tore through my body. The pain was blinding. It felt as though my very bones were being crushed in an industrial vice. I clamped my eyes shut, biting down on my bottom lip until I tasted warm blood, desperately trying to breathe through the sheer agony. After what felt like an eternity of sliding through the frozen white void, Sarah forcefully swerved the truck into the snow-choked parking lot of a small, dilapidated emergency medical outpost situated at the base of the foothills. It was a miserable, forgotten structure. Half of the exterior lights were completely dead, and the wind violently rattled the loose wooden shingles on the roof. Sarah practically kicked the passenger door open. She hauled me out of the truck, wrapping her thick arm around my waist, and dragged my trembling body through the knee-deep snow. We burst through the clinic doors, bringing a swirling cloud of freezing wind inside with us. The interior of the clinic was plunged into a dim, sickly yellow hue. The main power lines had snapped under the weight of the ice, and the facility was barely surviving on a failing backup generator. There was only one medical professional on duty, an older, visibly exhausted nurse whose eyes widened in sheer panic the moment she saw my massive, soaking wet frame. Sarah hauled me onto a narrow, uncomfortable examination bed. The nurse rushed over, her hands shaking as she strapped an ancient fetal monitor to my taut stomach. The machine emitted a harsh static noise before picking up the rapid, thumping sound of my baby's heart. "I need you to tell me what you are feeling," the nurse demanded, her voice cracking as she quickly pulled on a pair of sterile latex gloves. "It is too early," I screamed, my voice echoing off the peeling walls as another monstrous contraction ripped through my core. "I am only 34 weeks. The nurse performed a rapid physical examination. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking paler than the snow outside. She stumbled backward, her gloved hands raised in absolute horror. "The baby is breech," she stammered, looking frantically between Sarah and me. "Feet first, the cervix is rapidly dilating, but the baby is stuck. I do not have the surgical equipment to perform an emergency cesarean section here. The operating room has been gutted for renovations." Before anyone could speak, the rhythmic thumping coming from the monitor suddenly shifted. The fast, steady drumbeat began to slow down. The sound became terrifyingly sluggish. The fetal heart rate was dropping. My baby was suffocating in the birth canal. Absolute, unadulterated terror seized my throat. I grabbed the cold metal railing of the bed, my knuckles turning stark white. "Do something," I begged, tears of pure panic streaming down my face. "Please save my baby." The nurse sprinted across the dim room to a heavy-duty emergency radio transceiver mounted on the wall. The cellular networks were completely dead, buried under the ice. She grabbed the microphone, her thumb aggressively pressing the transmission button. "Mayday! Mayday! This is the Foothills Outpost," she shouted over the loud static crackling from the speaker. "I have a maternal emergency. 34 weeks, severe premature labor, breech presentation, and dropping fetal heart tones. I need a surgical specialist immediately." A garbled, heavily distorted voice broke through the radio static. "This is the State Medical Rescue Convoy. We are trapped by a minor avalanche 3 miles north of your position. Our heavy transport is completely snowbound. If someone does not get here in the next 10 minutes, this infant is going to die," the nurse screamed into the microphone, completely abandoning any shred of professional composure. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the freezing clinic, broken only by my ragged screams and the agonizingly slow heartbeat of my dying child on the monitor. Sarah stood beside me, gripping my hand so tightly I thought my fingers would shatter. I closed my eyes, consumed by a blinding wave of despair. I had fought so hard. I had survived the humiliation, the divorce, the betrayal, all to build a safe life for this child. And now, the universe was brutally stripping it all away in a freezing, forgotten room. Then, a new sound cut through the howling wind. It started as a low, mechanical growl, growing louder and more aggressive with every passing second. It was the heavy, thundering roar of a massive diesel engine. Heavy metal plow blades scraped violently against the frozen asphalt outside. A massive emergency snowcat vehicle had forcefully rammed its way into the clinic's parking lot. Heavy boots pounded furiously against the wooden porch steps outside. The main doors of the clinic were violently kicked open, slamming hard against the interior wall. A swirling vortex of snow and sub-zero air rushed into the room. A tall figure stepped through the threshold, shaking off a heavy layer of white snow. He was wearing an intense, high-visibility winter rescue suit over dark green surgical scrubs. He quickly pulled off his protective snow goggles and lowered the thermal mask covering his face, his eyes immediately scanning the room for the patient. My vision was swimming in a haze of excruciating pain, but I did not need perfect eyesight to recognize the sharp angle of his jaw or the familiar, frantic intensity in his eyes. It was the sole medical specialist from the stranded convoy. It was the man who had discarded me like broken glass. It was Dr. Julian Vance. Julian moved with the crisp, mechanical efficiency of a veteran trauma surgeon. He did not look at my face immediately. His eyes were entirely focused on the panicked nurse and the erratic, jagged green lines spiking across the ancient fetal monitor. He violently stripped off his heavy snow-crusted gloves, letting them hit the wooden floor with a dull thud. "What is the exact situation?" he barked. His tone carried that familiar, commanding edge I used to hear when he took emergency hospital calls in the middle of the night. The nurse rapidly rattled off the terrifying vitals, emphasizing the breech presentation and the severely dropping fetal heart tones. Julian nodded sharply. He stepped up to the edge of my narrow, creaking examination bed. He reached down, gripping the edge of the silver foil emergency blanket that was draped over my lower half. He yanked it back in one swift motion. And then, he completely froze. The impenetrable, professional mask he wore shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. All the warmth instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. His dark eyes traveled frantically from the agonizing, massive swell of my late-stage pregnant abdomen, up my shivering, sweat-drenched torso, until they finally crashed directly into my wide, terrified gaze. He stopped breathing. I could physically see the shockwaves rippling through his brain as he desperately tried to compute the completely impossible mathematics of the situation unfolding right in front of him. We had been divorced for exactly 7 months. I was 34 weeks pregnant. The woman his father had publicly discarded as a barren, defective mold was now writhing in the throes of imminent motherhood. A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the freezing room, thicker and far more oppressive than the raging blizzard outside. For 2 agonizing, suspended seconds, we were no longer a desperate doctor and a dying patient. We were the tragic ghosts of a broken, deceitful marriage, colliding in the worst possible intersection of fate. His jaw went completely slack, and his lips parted as if he wanted to whisper my name, but no sound came out. A sudden, monstrous contraction violently ripped through my uterus, snapping the invisible tether between us. It forced a blood-curdling scream out of my raw throat. Simultaneously, the ancient fetal monitor began shrieking a terrifying, high-pitched alarm. The baby's heart rate was plummeting rapidly into the lethal danger zone. "Dr. Vance," the nurse yelled, her voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated panic. "We are losing the fetal heartbeat. You need to intervene right now." The nurse's frantic screaming yanked Julian back from the edge of his psychological paralysis. He violently shook his head, physically blinking away the paralyzing shock. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his throat, and ruthlessly forced the shattered fragments of his professional composure back into place. He had to suppress every single personal emotion, every ounce of confusion, to become the medical savior he was trained to be. "We do not have the time or the sterile surgical environment to cut her open," Julian commanded, his voice now entirely devoid of any personal connection as he rapidly scrubbed his hands with harsh chemical antiseptic from a wall dispenser. "The child is completely stuck in the birth canal. I have to perform an external cephalic version. I have to turn the baby manually from the outside." Sarah gripped my trembling shoulder, her eyes wide with absolute terror. My engineering mind instantly grasped the terrifying mechanics of what he was proposing. It was an incredibly painful, forceful, manual manipulation of the fetus straight through the uterine wall. It was a brutal procedure typically performed under powerful epidural anesthesia in a highly controlled, fully equipped hospital setting. I had absolutely nothing. I only had the dim, flickering yellow light of the failing backup generator and the freezing draft pouring in from the warped window frames. Julian stepped squarely between my knees. He looked up at me, his eyes dark, haunted, and swarming with a million unspoken questions. "Autumn," he said, his voice barely a rasp beneath the howling wind rattling the roof. "This is going to hurt more than anything you have ever experienced in your entire life. But you have to trust me. I will not let this baby die." The sheer, infuriating audacity of that single word, trust, a violent, scorching surge of pure, unadulterated hatred boiled up in the very back of my throat. I hated him for walking away from me without a fight. I hated him for sitting in silence while his tyrannical father humiliated me. I hated that the very hands that had signed the divorce papers destroying my life were now hovering over my swollen belly. But as another crushing, seismic wave of pain tore through my shattered pelvis, reality ruthlessly forced my pride to its knees. I had absolutely no other choice. To save my innocent child, I had to completely surrender my body and my baby's fragile existence entirely into the bloody, capable hands of the man who had abandoned me. I nodded exactly once, biting down on my bottom lip so fiercely that I tasted a fresh, hot wave of copper blood. Julian placed both of his large, incredibly strong hands firmly against the taut, desperately stretched skin of my abdomen. He meticulously located the baby's fragile head wedged near my ribs and the rigid spine trapped lower down in my pelvis. "Hold her shoulders down," Julian forcefully ordered Sarah and the nurse. "Do not let her thrash, or I could rupture the uterus." And then he pushed. The physical agony was absolute, blinding, and catastrophic. It felt as though he were trying to manually rip my internal organs from their structural moorings. I screamed until my vocal cords physically shredded, my fingers digging into Sarah's heavy winter jacket with the crushing force of a hydraulic press. Julian gritted his teeth, heavy beads of sweat pouring down his pale forehead as he applied massive, calculated, biomechanical pressure. He was violently fighting against my naturally contracting muscles, trying to physically rotate the trapped infant inside the hostile environment of my womb. It was a brutal, medieval battle of tearing flesh and sheer, desperate willpower. I kept my eyes locked furiously on the water-stained ceiling, absolutely refusing to look at his face. I poured every single ounce of my hatred, my betrayal, and my profound grief into the agonizing effort of simply staying conscious. "Almost there," Julian grunted, the muscles in his forearms shaking violently from the extreme physical exertion. "Just one more rotation." A sickening, heavy shifting sensation rolled violently through my core, immediately followed by an intense, overwhelming pressure dropping deep into my lower pelvis. "The head is down!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking with a wild mixture of absolute exhaustion and raw, desperate relief. "The airway is clear. Autumn, you need to push. You have to give me everything you have left." For the next 2 grueling, agonizing hours, the tiny, freezing clinic transformed into a harrowing war zone of survival. I pushed until black. Dizzying spots danced violently across my vision. I pushed until my lungs felt like they were entirely filled with crushed glass. Every single time I wanted to give up. Every time my body threatened to shut down. I thought of Arthur Vance's cruel, sneering face. I thought of the fake medical records hidden in my bag. I channeled every drop of my burning rage into pure, explosive physical fuel. Finally, with one last, earth-shattering scream that felt like it tore my very soul from my body, the agonizing, crushing pressure miraculously vanished. A heavy, breathless, utterly terrifying silence hung in the dim clinic for one singular, suspended second. Then it happened. A sharp, piercing, furious wail erupted into the freezing air. It was the most beautiful, triumphant, defiant sound I had ever heard in my entire existence. Julian stood at the end of the bed, his broad shoulders heaving, his chest rising and falling in rapid, jagged, desperate breaths, his hands, completely slick and stained with my blood, gently cradled the tiny, squalling, perfectly formed body of a baby boy. The historic storm raged relentlessly outside the frail wooden walls. But inside that dilapidated mountain clinic, a brand new life had just forcefully, miraculously claimed its rightful place in the world. Julian held the crying infant in his hands, hastily wrapping the tiny, squirming body in a sterile thermal towel. His arms, usually so steady in the operating room, were shaking violently. I watched his dark eyes dart back and forth as his brilliant medical mind began to process the impossible timeline. We signed the divorce papers exactly 7 months ago. I had just given birth to a premature infant at exactly 34 weeks. The chronological math was completely undeniable. The frantic, professional intensity in his eyes suddenly morphed into a profound, earth-shattering realization. This tiny, fragile life screaming in his bloody hands was his own biological flesh and blood. His legs seemed to lose all structural integrity. Julian collapsed heavily to his knees right there on the wet, blood-stained floorboards of the clinic. He brought the swaddled baby incredibly close to his chest, burying his face into the warm towel. Hot, desperate tears streamed freely down his pale cheeks, mixing with the sweat of his exhaustion. "Autumn," he choked out, his voice a pathetic, broken sob that barely rose above the howling wind outside. "Why did you not tell me? Why did you hide this from me? This is our child. This is my son." I did not cry. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy or residual love for the weeping man groveling on the floor. I felt nothing but cold, absolute clarity. The exhausted nurse gently stepped forward and took the baby from his trembling arms to finish cleaning and weighing my son. I looked over at Sarah, who was standing fiercely by the doorway like a guardian. I gave her a single, sharp nod. Sarah immediately reached into my heavy leather work bag. She pulled out the thick brown envelope I had carried with me every single day since that secretive meeting at the diner. She did not politely hand it to him. She threw it with the force of a brick. The heavy packet hit Julian squarely in the chest, bursting open and scattering the tightly folded documents onto the floor right in front of his knees. "Open it," I commanded. My voice was no longer the desperate, agonizing scream of a woman in labor. It was a blade of pure, freezing steel. Julian wiped his eyes, his fingers trembling uncontrollably as he picked up the scattered documents. The very first page he saw was my authentic fertility analysis. Perfect, flawless. The second page was his own. He stared at the disastrous numbers, his extensive medical expertise instantly translating the biological data. He saw his own absolute failure. He realized that this premature baby was a 1 in a million medical miracle that he could likely never replicate. Then, His eyes fell upon the offshore bank transfers. $75,000. He saw the printed, encrypted emails from Arthur Vance, his beloved, tyrannical father, meticulously orchestrating the entire magnificent lie. Julian stopped breathing, the crushing reality of what his father had done, what his father had permanently stolen from him, crashed down upon him like a collapsing skyscraper. He had traded his loyal wife and his only biological miracle for a fabricated lie manufactured by a ruthless monster. Julian let out a guttural, agonizing scream. It was the horrific sound of a man watching his entire universe burn to the ground. He violently clawed at his hair, begging the universe for forgiveness, cursing his father's name into the freezing air. He tried to crawl toward the side of my narrow bed, reaching out with a desperate, shaking hand. He lied to me, Julian wept, his face completely contorted in sheer suffocating agony. My father destroyed us. Please, Autumn, you have to believe me. I did not know. The nurse gently placed my warm, beautifully perfect son against my chest. I wrapped my arms securely around my baby, inhaling the sweet, intoxicating scent of new life. I looked down at the broken, hollow shell of the golden boy I used to love. Your father lied, I said, my voice echoing with terrifying, absolute finality. But you were the one who chose not to protect me. You let him humiliate me in front of the world. You blindly chose your inheritance over your wife, and because of your cowardice, you get absolutely nothing. The heavy rumble of massive diesel engines interrupted the tense silence. The main state rescue convoy had finally cleared the avalanche and arrived at the outpost. Paramedics rushed through the broken doors with proper medical stretchers and heavy thermal blankets. As they prepared to load me and my newborn son into the heated transport vehicle, Julian desperately tried to step forward. I raised my hand, stopping him dead in his tracks. Do not ever come near us again, I warned him, my eyes locking onto his shattered gaze one last time. I left him standing in the dim, freezing ruin of that dilapidated clinic. He was a highly respected surgeon and the heir to a massive real estate empire, but in that defining moment, he was utterly bankrupt. I stepped out into the cold, crisp mountain air, holding the only legacy that mattered. Finally stepping into my brand new life with the unshakable posture of a victor. Thank you so much for listening to the very end of my story. Where are you listening from today? Please let me know in the comments below. As I mentioned earlier, our channel is facing a tough time since YouTube disabled our monetization. If you felt moved by my journey today, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can scan the PayPal QR code on your screen or use the link in the description or the pinned comment. Your kindness helps pay our dedicated staff so they can feed their families and continue bringing you more powerful stories. Thank you, and take care.